Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and get started just so I make sure we don't cut our time short today. Give me 1 second while I share my screen. All right, are we looking okay over there? Everyone can see my slides? I'm going to take that as a yes. All right, hello everyone, and thank you so much for being here. We're excited to welcome you to our March webinar on community science and bumblebee conservation. As always, this webinar series, is hosted by People and Pollinators Action Network, a nonprofit here in Colorado focusing on pollinator conservation and human health as avenues for protecting the broader biodiversity and balance of our natural ecosystems. We use a multifaceted approach to our work, engaging in grassroots organizing, collaboration within our communities, and advocacy at all decision-making levels. We really believe in the power of education and community empowerment to protect not only our native pollinator populations, but also our local communities. So today we'll be hearing from Leif Richardson, who is a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society and has led the development of the California Bumble Bee Atlas project to monitor and document bee populations around the state. We'll be learning more about the project and native bumblebee ecology as a whole throughout the discussion today. So some of you might be wondering why this particular topic is relevant to us here in Colorado. So I'll just give you a brief update on some of our major projects and Colorado-specific reasons to be really interested and invested in this work. As some of you may know, the Colorado Native Pollinating Insects Study is now underway, and this is focused on compiling everything we know about native pollinator populations in Colorado, from their population numbers to their threats, and very importantly, what gaps in the data there are that need to be filled in order for us to have a more comprehensive understanding of the state of pollinators in our area. Without this kind of information, we can't approach pollinator conservation very effectively. What we already know is that Colorado is home to, I believe, 24 different species of bumblebees alone, and our pollinators are all experiencing severe population decline due to pesticides, climate change, habitat loss, disease, and lots of other factors. So this native pollinating insect study will not only expand dramatically on our knowledge base, but will also incorporate community action through education, outreach, and what we're calling a big day of community science, where members of the public can go out and document pollinators they see in their everyday lives and help contribute to our growing understanding of pollinator numbers and diversity around the state. The California Bumble Bee Atlas project that we'll be hearing about today is a really fantastic model for what more we can be doing in Colorado and what we might be able to achieve with regard to pollinator science and conservation. Once again, thank you all so much for being here and supporting our webinars. A couple of basic reminders before we get started. Please stay on mute for the duration of today's discussion and instead leave any questions you may have for our speaker in the chat so that I can compile them and get to as many as possible at the end of the session. Also, if you're interested in our work at People and Pollinators and want to support our efforts, please visit our website for more information. It's down there in the bottom corner. And you can find helpful resources there, sign up for our monthly newsletter, or get involved as a volunteer. Also, consider following us on Instagram and Facebook. We're just at People and Pollinators. And please, please, please consider making a donation through our website so we can continue doing this important work and hosting free educational events like this one. I will put the link in the chat to the donation form. And with that, I am excited to welcome Leif Richardson.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started with some slides. Nicole, can you see that first slide? Yeah.
Yes,
right,
you're good to go.
Okay, so as you heard, my name is Leif Richardson, and I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And my principal job responsibility is leading the California Bumble Bee Atlas. I'm going to be talking to you today about bumblebee ecology, a bit about the conservation needs of bumblebees, and then about this project, the California Bumble Bee Atlas, a community science effort to inventory the bumblebees of the state of California. And I'm going to be showing you some results from our first field season. So first, a bit about the Xerces Society. We protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We divide our work into 5 different programs, one on native pollinators and their habitats, another on endangered species, and that's where I work, aquatic invertebrates, a whole project on butterfly conservation, and then one on pesticides and pesticide policy. We do a range of things to accomplish our goals, including we're involved in education, conservation, research, and advocacy. So we work with the general public, with other scientists, with government, and many others to affect change on behalf of invertebrates. We do an awful lot of science. So that means that we work with public agencies, with private researchers, landowners, to better understand the distribution of these invertebrates and also what their habitat needs might be. And our work often has us looking at those at-risk invertebrates, although we of course care about the ones that are not yet at risk also, as you'll hear here. In our scientific work, we do an awful lot of community science, sometimes called citizen science, although I prefer the term community science because citizenship really has nothing to do with it. We have Bumblebee Atlases going in 15 states this year, including California, as you'll hear. We have Bumblebeewatch, which is a data management platform for bumblebee-based bumblebee observations. So whether you're a part of one of our Atlas projects or not, you can participate in Bumblebeewatch. We do numerous activities with monarch butterflies, including the Western monarch counts at Thanksgiving and New Year's, as well as mapping the distribution of milkweeds that are important to those monarch butterflies as larval host plants. We have a project on freshwater mussels. We have a brand new Firefly Atlas, which I encourage you to check out, and a number of other things. So there's a link below there to our community science page, and I encourage you to get involved with our community science projects if you're interested. Xerces also does a bunch of policy development and advocacy work. So this is our director testifying about an invertebrate conservation issue. And we do a lot of education and training. So to date, we've reached more than 100,000 professional biologists since we started doing this work. And we've trained people in all 50 states, as well as Canada, Mexico, Europe, and Asia. And at the end of all this, we've done an awful lot of on-the-ground conservation. So we've supported pollinator habitat restoration or creation on over 900,000 acres of land. And we've protected or restored 1.5 million acres for rare and at-risk invertebrates. We're a nonprofit, and this work is supported by grants and by donations. So if you are so inclined, please get involved and become a member. Thank you. All right, so today I'll be talking about bumblebees, as I said, and I'll be focused on the California Bumble Bee Atlas. So before getting started, I wanted to just quickly tell you what it is before we get into depth on this. The community science project of the Xerces Society with our partners, which includes the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We have funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, and many other organizations and individuals. So individuals are collecting bumblebee data statewide. It's a non-lethal method. So volunteers catch bees, they photograph them, and then they release them unharmed. And we'll get into more detail about this soon. So let's talk about how bumblebees live and what's going wrong for some of these species. First of all, as you're probably aware, bumblebees are social insects with an annual life cycle. This is different from honeybees. They're one of their closer relatives because honeybees are perennials. They live, one colony can live for several years. And the purpose of honey, the thing that we're most aware of honeybees for, the purpose of honey is to get that colony through the wintertime. So honey is a storage product that the bees lay aside for the lean times in winter when they can't go out and forage. And this allows them to be perennial organisms. By contrast, bumblebees have this 1 year life cycle. So it initiates in springtime and it finishes up in the fall. So I have this life cycle diagram here, and the star shows you where you are now. If you're in Colorado, you're at number 5, with the bees still in subterranean hibernating. If you're on the coast of California, you're at number 1, or even further along the line here. But basically, in springtime at the star, bumblebee queens who have previously mated will come out of the ground, out of hibernation, and they'll forage for nectar and pollen. And they'll also search for suitable places to start a colony, usually a pre-existing cavity underground or sometimes above ground. They store a bunch of nectar and pollen there. Then they lay eggs and start incubating those eggs, which turn into larvae. It takes about 6 weeks before the first adult offspring emerge from the nest. At that time, those so-called workers, so they're sterile, non-reproductive female offspring of the queen, they take over most of the foraging, brood care, and other tasks, work tasks of the colony. And the queen now stays home and lays eggs and eats and is cared for by her daughters. At some point, the colony stops making non-reproductive female offspring and switches over to making reproductives, both males and gines, or these new queens who will go out and find mates. After mating and eating a lot, those mated gines will enter hibernation. And so that's the annual life cycle. They spend most of, let's say, it depends on where you are, but they can spend the majority of an annual cycle with the queen in hibernation. So there's a substantial amount of time where the bees are not active. And I like to tell people that although these are eusocial insects with a highly developed series of communication methods, both a variety of different ways of communicating and regulating a nest, most of the year, that female is solitary. So during the hibernation period, she's all by herself underground, actually not able to forage or defend herself or fly. Later, she's out starting the nest, and it's not until her first bunch of offspring come out that she has other individuals in the nest. So there's a long period of time when bumblebees are actually solitary insects, and this is reflected in their gene expression and their behavior. And I just think it's important for people to understand that although these are social insects, they're eusocial insects, there's a pronounced solitary phase where one single female is doing all of the activities of the species. One interesting aspect of nesting biology that I like to tell people about is that bumblebee nests are this resource that can be attacked by all sorts of other insects. And one particularly fascinating example of this is that there are some bumblebees that do not make their own nests, and they are in fact social parasites. We call these cuckoo bumblebees. The technical term for the subgenus of bumblebees that are cuckoos is Psithyris, Psithyhrus, and I'll call them cuckoo bumblebees. In this image, you can see a bumblebee nest with workers and a queen on the left. You can see nectar stored in honey pots, and these bulbous things are larval waxen pouches containing larvae. And then you see a pupa there, the sort of egg-shaped spotted thing. On the right, you see a female bumblebee of a different species who is a cuckoo bumblebee. She has just entered this nest. She's going to aggressively take over the nest. She may fight with those workers. She may kill some of them, and she'll use pheromones to change their behavior and force them to rear her offspring. So this is a peril that bumblebees face in springtime as the colony gets off of the ground. And it's just a particularly interesting piece of the natural history. There are other non-bumblebee interlopers that enter bumblebee colonies, and we'll skip over talking about them for now. But I wanted you to think about the fact that although these are social insects with a pronounced solitary phase, as I just said, there are some individual species within bumblebees that have evolved a different life history, a different way of making a living, and that is attacking another type of bumblebee, as opposed to foraging for their own pollen, their own nest site, and founding a colony in that way. So why do we care enough about bumblebees that I'm sitting here talking to you about them today? Well, there are lots of reasons to care about bumblebees. Personally, I think we should care about them for intrinsic reasons. They're native insects here, and they're very interesting, and I'm just glad that they're alive. But a compelling functional reason that we should care about bumblebees is that they're pollinators. But bees in general are something of a keystone group of species. meaning they're ecological keystones in that without bees, we would see substantial changes to the ecosystems that they inhabit. And this is because something like 85% of flowering land plants require an animal, usually an insect, to move pollen between male parts of flowers and female parts of flowers. That's pollination, right? Not all of those 85% of plants are absolutely dependent on those insects, but it's those organisms, those plants do better on balance if they have a pollinator. So pollinators are really important to natural communities and ecosystems with native plants in them. Bees are also very important as crop pollinators, and it's estimated that 10% of the total economic yield or value of agriculture is due only to pollination, not to other sorts of inputs of nitrogen or land management or labor. 10% is just what the bees are doing, and other pollinators in some cases. As you're no doubt familiar, honeybees are these really important agricultural pollinators that are moved around from farm to farm, from crop to crop to pollinate. But something that is a stunner for many people is that on balance, if you look at agriculture generally, whether or not honeybees are a part of the picture, it's native bees, it's wild bees that tend to do the majority of the pollination in agriculture. So the heavy lifting of pollination that contributes so much value to our food system is being done by wild animals. And it's being done by wild animals that we're not usually managing for. We're often managing against them, unfortunately. And we may not even be aware as growers that they exist and are part of our economy. So these native bees, these wild bees are very important, both for the way that they interact with the ecosystems that they inhabit, but also the fact that they come to farms and end up pollinating crops as they forage for their own food. So just to put a point on this, when we are outside and looking at the land, we need to think about plant communities as being underpinned by pollinators. So this is a coastal, restored coastal shrubland in Northern California, a lot of native plants in flower at the same time. And it's just important when you look out across this landscape to remember that these bees are moving these microscopic particles of pollen back and forth between these plants. And that's where the action is, among other places. That's where the action is in terms of plant communities from my definition. Unfortunately, bumblebees are in trouble. It's not all species, but many of these bumblebees are having some conservation concerns, conservation issues that we are concerned about. This is a somewhat busy graphic from a really great paper that looked at the IUCN Red List categories for bumblebees across the world. The Red List is a list that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has that assesses how rare and how at risk of extinction different species are. And what I want you to see from these pie charts is that for places where we have good data, like Europe and North America, roughly a quarter of bumblebee species are at some risk for extinction. Either they're critically endangered now, or they're just vulnerable. And the other 3/4 we think are secure. But look at all of the gray, empty pie charts there. Most of the world where a lot of the world's bumblebee diversity occurs, we don't know enough to say whether any of the species are in trouble, what fraction of the species are in trouble. So first of all, we have a big problem in terms of declining bumblebee species. And second, we have a very thorny problem in terms of lack of data for assessing and responding to these declines. And as I just told you, these animals actually matter to our life and livelihood. And so this lack of information should really be concerning. Here in California, we have 4 species that are currently candidates for listing under the state's Endangered Species Act, sometimes abbreviated as CISA. Those are from top left clockwise, Crotch's bumblebee, or Bombus crotchii, Franklin bumblebee, or Bombus franklini, Suckley bumblebee, Bombus sucklei, and Western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. And these maps are from a recent publication by some of my colleagues. And the dark dots show you recent observations of these bees, and the lighter colored dots show you older observations. And the point of these graphs is to show you that the distributions of those bees have changed to some extent between a historic period and a more recent period. Now, there are lots of reasons that bees are declining. to summarize briefly, we could say that it's climate change, it's habitat loss, pesticide exposure, and pathogen exposure. And I don't have time to go into each of those in detail, but we can talk more at the end about any of those if you're interested. So one of the things that we can do to address these declines is actually to collect more information. We actually don't know enough about the distribution of these bees in the state of California, or indeed elsewhere, to really say why they're declining and how we can recover them. So this is a map showing the Western bumblebee. Now I've used different colors, but you can see the framing is the same. We have a historical time period in orange, and then the more recent last 20 years in blue. And you can see that the bee is now only found in a few places in the northern Sierra Nevada mountains, and there's one observation from the northern mountains in California. We can use this data to model where we think the bee should occur. So where's their suitable habitat around the state? And then this can start to guide us in doing more field surveys. And so my point in this slide is just to make the case that we need a lot of things. We need to bring back habitat for bees. We need to stop using pesticides to the extent that we are, and other things. But one thing we really need is data. We need more information about these bees. And that is actually why, among the reasons that we've started the California Bumble Bee Atlas. Despite more than a century of people doing the hard work of collecting bees around the state, pinning them and putting them into museum collections where that information is lasting, we still have a lot of uncertainty about how to manage actually conserve them. So let me talk a little bit about the methods that we're using in this project. Again, it's community science, and so the labor is principally performed by volunteers. I'm one of the only paid staff people who are working on this project, and we have hundreds of people working on this project. So it's a volunteer effort, and I like to just emphasize that. It's kind of amazing to think about so much donated labor in the service of conservation. And I know I'm not the first person to point this out, but I wanted to just stop and say that the people are really absolutely critical to this endeavor. And we scientists can do our research and publish our papers, but amateur naturalists, community scientists can make enormous contributions to the conservation of nature. And I hope you'll agree after seeing this talk that this is an example of a place where volunteers, rank amateurs, have made real contributions. So we attract volunteers through a variety of means. We give a lot of talks, we do social media stuff, and in other ways we reach potential volunteers. We do live remote training that is Zoom based. We also do in-person field events. We used to do in-person training events before COVID. Now we only do in-person outdoor events. And these are some photos from some of those events. And so the methods of the project, briefly, the volunteer will choose the part of the state that they want to work in. And we've got a grid map across the state, as you can see in the bottom right there. We've divided into three time periods, 3 starting dates, depending on climate and the bee's phenology. And those white squares are simply non-priority areas from last year, from 2022. As you'll see later, we're now considering the whole state to be a priority. But in that first year, we asked volunteers to prioritize certain cells over others. So they tell us which cell they're going to work in. These are large areas. They're 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. And we don't expect the volunteer to thoroughly survey that area, but we expect them to do 2 or more surveys in the summer in that area at sites of their choosing. It can be the same site or on different days separated by 3 months or 3 weeks or more, or it could be different sites on the same day. There's a lot of flexibility for the volunteers in terms of that sort of thing. We do a timed survey. It's a 45-minute effort of collecting bees. The bees, when we collect them, they go into a vial, then they go into the cooler. And after the timed period, those bees are anesthetized by cold, and we are able to take them from the cooler one at a time, dump them out on the notebook, handle them without fear of being stung, and take great photos and identify what species they are. These volunteers later upload their results to bumblebeewatch.org, which is our data management platform, which I referenced earlier. We've created a number of resources to support volunteers, and I'll highlight just two of those. This is from a sort of digital field guide that I made. So there's a page for each of the species, and we teach based on this stuff. So we teach field characters that you're looking for when you want to identify this bee. So for example, there's a prominent yellow stripe on the fourth abdominal segment. There's black hair on the underside of the abdomen in this case. And we've got a nice range map and some graphics from the Bumblebees of North America field guide. Another thing we've done is produce this one pager for, it's a field guide of sorts, but it's just a thumbnail sketch to carry in the field with you to get a rough idea of which bee you might be seeing. And the idea is for the volunteer to take these thumbnail sketches, these little cartoons, and try to translate that into the animal that they have in hand. And in this case, the person would hopefully have looked at the color pattern of the hair and seen that contrasting yellow, black, yellow, and with the two red stripes on the abdomen, all agree with Bombus huntii or Hunt's bumblebee, as opposed to one of the other ones. And in this case, I've divided the bees into 5 rough categories. This is not good enough for identification of all specimens, but it's the kind of thing where we hope that this helps people get interested in identification, and then they can take it further by getting the field guide and getting a hand lens and getting more into it. So with that, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about our results from 2022. And I'm sorry, this says 2023. That is an error. This is last year's data. So first of all, there were about 240 volunteers who collected data for us, and they did about 459 surveys around the state. I should say we did those surveys because I also performed surveys and other people did as well. You can see the surveys on this map, which I've symbolized according to whether we found bees in the survey or not. And so you can just see places in the state where we maybe tended to find no bees despite 45 minutes of effort, as opposed to places where we did find bees. There's a strong seasonal component to this too, as we'll get into. Overall, we collected about 4,000 bee observations, and no bees had to die for this. We've got photos of every one of those bees. And we know that we had 25 species historically present in the state. We found 22 of them in the first year of the survey. The other 3, I think we're going to find one of them, and we'll see about the other 2. So let's look at how the different species are faring relative to historical baselines. This is a graph where across the x-axis you can see frequency, and this is the frequency for each species named on the y-axis in the collection. And I have 2 collections symbolized on this graph. One is the 2022 California Bumble Bee Atlas data. Again, I've said 2023 here in the title, sorry about that. The other is a historic data set. It's associated with that field guide I mentioned a minute ago. It's a database that I created of historical observations of bumblebees. And so what I'm doing here is comparing the commonness, the relative commonness of a species in 2022 to its relative commonness historical data set. And so anywhere that you see the green square to the left of the blue square, that would indicate a decline in relative commonness or frequency, and vice versa, that would indicate an increase. One problem with this data, you might notice that the second name on the vertical axis is Vaz_cow. That is not a bumblebee species. That is a category for one of 2 species. So Vosnesenskii and Calagenosis are 2 bumblebee species that are very similar in appearance, and we cannot reliably separate them from photos for males and for some females. So fully 25% of all of the bees photographed in this project fell into this category, where we were not able to unequivocally say that it was one species or the other. And so that's unfortunate. We expected that. And to better understand this graph, I'd like to just remove those guys. And then we can see who's relatively more common now and relatively less common. And there's an example there for Bombus occidentalis towards the bottom, where I've put that purple arrow. That is and that is a real decline. I showed you a slide earlier that shows that we have far fewer observations of this bee now than we used to have. There are some problems with this approach of comparing our data from 2022 to a historic data set, but I'm going to skip talking about the weaknesses of relative abundance for now, but I'd be happy to take questions about it later. I don't have time to talk about each of the 22 species that we observed, but I'm going to choose just 2 of them to do a little compare and contrast here over the next several slides. So I've chosen Bombus bifarius, which is a very common species in California where it occurs, and Bombus crotchii, which is a declining species and was on that graph where 4 species are candidates for listing as endangered in the state. And that's a photo of crotchii to the left there. That's a male with those very large eyes. This is a characteristic of this subgenus of bumblebees. What I want you to notice in these graphs is blue dots on top of gray dots showing the 2022 data compared to the historic data now mapped out. For bifarius, you should be able to see that we found the bee in many of the same regions that we historically found the bee. So we don't see any coherent sign of a loss of range here. However, if you look at crotchii, just from our 1 year of collecting in 2022, you can see that we failed to find the bee throughout Southern California, most of the places that we looked. So despite it being historically very common from Los Angeles to San Diego and eastward somewhat, we were not able to find it there last year. So this is a way that we can start to think about spatial changes in where bees occur. Let's talk about plants. So here, this is the same two species again. And so for every bee that a volunteer uploaded to our database, they told us what host plant the bee was foraging on. And in fact, they submitted a photo. So I was able to check their identifications. I'm just using the plant genus name here as opposed to the species, because we have literally something like 220 genera of plants that were used by the bees. California is a very plant diverse place, and many hundreds more individual plant species that are named. And we have not been able to verify all of those plant names to species. So I'm just showing you genus here. These are generalist animals. They eat hundreds of different types of pollen and nectar. But I want you to notice that for this pair of species, there are pronounced differences in their diet. So for example, the top plant there is Asclepias or milkweed, and you can see that it was the most important plant for Bombus crotchii. It is a big fan of milkweeds. So if you want to help this bee, you should plant milkweeds, among other things. By contrast, Bombus bifarius, the common species, just ignored milkweed. It flew right over it and used other plants, notably solidago or goldenrod, but also monardella, that ubiquitous group of California plants in the mid-family. So the point here is that even though these guys are generalists, they have distinct preferences for plants. And when we think about doing restoration for bumblebees or for bees in general, we need to think about diversity. Surprisingly, perhaps, we even see differences between the sexes in their diet preference. And so here I'm showing you that one species, Bombus bifarius, the gray bars are male and the blue bars are female. And this is, again, the frequency or relative commonness of each of these host plants in the diet. And so you can see that the males are preferring things like goldenrod and thistles, while the females are preferring things like phacelia and delphinium and vicia is vetch. So the reason for this is probably the females are collecting pollen in addition to nectar, while the males are just feeding themselves mostly nectar. There are some other reasons for these differences. But again, I want to make the point that if you are tasked with recovering a population of bumblebees, you need to think about the particular diet preferences of this supposedly generalist species. And you even need to think about differences among castes or sexes of the bee in terms of what they choose to eat. We found some interesting diurnal patterns in the data. So we see differences in abundance and diversity depending on what time of day the person started their collection and what the temperature was. So here I'm showing you temperature. It's something of a proxy for time of day in California. But you can see that we had the highest abundance in our collections between about 70 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not a surprise, but it does confirm our suspicions that when it's too hot, it's not a great time to look for bees. And then we found this interesting pattern for Bombus crotchii. Surveys where we ended up finding Bombus crotchii, this is again that rare declining species, surveys where we found it happened an hour earlier than surveys where we did not find it. So surveys where we ended up not finding it started on average around noon, and those where we ended up finding it started on average around 11 a.m. The point I want to make here is that some species of bees are active more often in the morning than the afternoon, or perhaps vice versa. In fact, I can say vice versa because we've done this for each species. There's some real patterning across the day to who you find. And this should get us thinking about what it means to sample bumblebees. If you sample at 10 a.m., you may have a different result than at 2 p.m. And I don't have strong guidance about what you should do with that information, but what you should do with it anyway is to think about this variance across the day and how you can maybe deal with it in your survey work. I'm almost done here. I want to talk about habitat preferences and ecosystems next. So we asked the volunteers to tell us what habitat each bee was collected in, and or each survey was conducted in. And then we looked at abundance and diversity of the collections based on those habitats. And so on the left, you see abundance. On the right, you see diversity or species richness. And so for abundance, the most important habitat, the best habitat was grasslands, followed by open canopied forests and wetlands, and so on. By contrast with diversity, the most important habitat was actually those open forests. And so just want to make that point that we have different processes going on here in terms of what drives abundance of bumblebees and what drives their diversity. We looked at where the bees were found in terms of ecoregions, and there's a real pronounced pattern here where, generally speaking, abundance is highest in the mountains. And so in this graph, the bottom five box plots there are all mountain ranges in the state. And then other parts of the state are places with less abundance towards the top of the graph. If we put species richness or diversity on, we can now see that mountains are still important to predicting richness, but one set of mountains, the Cascades, has dropped to sixth place there. So going back to abundance, the Cascades was the second most abundant bee spot, and it's not so important in terms of richness. So again, richness and abundance are partially decoupled there. And all of this is mediated by a number of things, but one really important factor in California, as it would be in Colorado, is elevation. So this graph shows our data with longitude plotted across the x-axis. So you can imagine the horizontal axis of the state of California from east to west. That's what I'm showing on the x-axis there. And then elevation might be a proxy for the mountain ranges in California. And the circles here are sized by species richness. So how many species did we find in a survey? And every circle is a survey. So what you should be able to see here is that the mountains, the Sierra Nevada mountains that are bracketed by the green dashed lines there are places with really high species richness. But if you were to go farther to the west, we have lower species richness in the other mountains, like the Cascades that I just talked about. Let's see. We also found that volunteer behavior affects the data. So in terms of that, the timing of the season obviously impacts when people survey. So we told them they couldn't go out until March 15th or April 15th or May 15th, depending on where they lived. And you can see when people did their surveys as a result of when the season began. We generally missed the early part of the season, and that affected the data for one bee in particular, Bombus melanopicus. And you can see that most surveys didn't really happen until summer really hit, until June. I'm going to skip that for in the interest of time. We also found this interesting thing where more surveyors in the field resulted in more bees found. And so we told people they could do their work solo, or they could bring a friend and just work for half as long. So we wanted the same survey effort regardless of how many people were surveying. And we did find that there's a significant positive correlation between the number of people surveying and the abundance of bees that they catch. This is not something to publish. It's not that exciting, but it does make a case. It's just sort of practical information that you can use to manage a community science project better. So we have all this information about our volunteers embedded in this data set that is helping me to plan the second year of the survey. So finally, what about that second year of the survey? Well, we've just a few days ago gotten underway with 2023 surveys in Southern California and the coast. We've edited our map somewhat, and now all cells in the map are priorities. We're focused this year on BLM-owned lands, and we're still looking for those 3 missing species: Bombus franklini, Kirby Ellis, or Baltiatus, as it used to be known, and Bombus sucklei. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leif. That was fascinating. You're definitely speaking my language with all of those beautiful graphs. So definitely appreciate those. We have quite a few questions, and I have a feeling we may get some more as people are digesting everything. But I'll start with what we have already in the chat, kind of going in order through your presentation. Our first question is, are bumblebee nests used again in following years, or just used one time and then new ones are constructed each consecutive year?
Good question. Bumblebees, they cannot dig their own nest cavity, and so they're dependent on other organisms to create those cavities, often rodents, or sometimes natural processes create a cavity in a tree or something. So some researchers have suggested that bumblebee nest sites might be limiting. They might fight over the good nest sites, and yes, they will reuse these sites from year to year. We think that they find them through odor cues, and so they may actually be looking for the smell of bumblebees when they're looking for nest sites. So if you just leave a nest, if you discover a bumblebee nest and you just leave it alone and it goes through winter, it may well get another bumblebee in the next spring. It could be a daughter from that colony, or it could be an unrelated female, but it will not be the same necessarily. It won't be the same queen. Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, thank you. Next question, how can you tell regular bumblebees apart from the cuckoo bees that you talked about?
Well, the cuckoos do not, so the cuckoos are true, they are real bumblebees. They're a subgenus, just like all the other ones fit into different subgenera. They do not collect pollen to feed their own offspring, right? So they have, over evolutionary time, have lost the adaptations for harvesting and carrying pollen. So the female does not have a broad, hairless, shiny area on the hind leg tarsus. It has a somewhat expanded area on the leg there, but it's usually got some hair on it, and it's sometimes dull in color instead of shiny. There are some other ways that we can distinguish the bees that are somewhat technical that I'll probably skip. One thing that you often notice with female cuckoo bumblebees is that they look armored. They look especially sort of strong, and they often have a recurved tail where the stinger is pointing somewhat toward the front of the animal as opposed to pointing out the back end. And that's probably an adaptation for fighting, for grappling other bees. And they do, with practice, you can see a really distinctive look to female cuckoo bumblebees that's related to that.
Interesting. So will they actually sting other bees when they're fighting?
Yeah, they so when they enter the nest of a prospective host, they will sometimes get into fights with the workers there, and yes, they will sting them to death. There's a lot of non-physical aggression or behavior that's involved with this, a lot of pheromone mediated behavior. So I think I read that they rarely actually kill the host queen. The host queen is often sort of spends the rest of her life cowering in the corner of the colony and not doing very much, but they let it live for some reason. So there's a lot we don't understand about the biology of these interactions, I would say.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so moving a little bit more onto like survey and research. Someone asked, are there any efforts to conduct research on bumblebee populations internationally in areas where there isn't very much data?
Yes. I showed that graph, that figure from a paper showing the big question marks in Asia.
Mhm.
In fact, there are researchers in numerous Asian countries who are doing really important work. There's significant work going on in China, which is the country with the highest diversity of bumblebees. Also in northern India, adjacent Tibet and Nepal, people are working on these bees around the world. And so we're starting to get more information, but it is a gradual process. And Europeans have just been paying attention to their bumblebees and making notes longer than most other people. And that's why we're able to say with some certainty, in a place like Britain, where they've had community science projects focused on bumblebees for 50 or 70 years or something. That's just not something we've done here, or let's say in China or somewhere else. So we're just catching up around the world.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, that's good to hear that people are starting to focus on this more. Now, pertaining more to your research, are iNaturalist records incorporated into your data sets?
So for the California Bumble Bee Atlas and all of the other Bumblebee Atlases that Xerces does, we use Bumblebeewatch as our data management platform. So all of the data goes there, and that is publicly available, but we currently don't share it to places like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF, but it is publicly available. I showed some historic data a couple of times there, and that's coming from this Bumblebee observation database that I created as part of that field guide that I mentioned. That data comes from all sorts of different sources, including iNaturalist. And so iNaturalist records are a really hugely important source of information about where bumblebees occur now. Not only bumblebees, of course, but yes, we use iNaturalist data extensively in our research, thinking about where the bees are now and where they are not.
So, well, that leads us very nicely into our next question. Can you briefly discuss the difference in bumblebee determinations in Bumblebeewatch that you use versus iNaturalist? And if we were to develop a similar Colorado atlas, would you recommend using Bumblebeewatch over iNaturalist?
Yeah, the two platforms are different. So as people probably know, iNaturalist is it crowdsources the identification. So you post a photo of something you saw, and then I come along and tell you what I think it is, and then someone else does the same. And after a certain number of agreements, it's said to be a research grade identification, and we can use that for science. Bumblebeewatch, usually it's just one person or 2 or 3 people doing the identifications, and it's usually in-house experts. So for our Bumblebee atlases, we have a committed person who is doing the identifications. I do all of the California work. But for people who just use Bumblebeewatch, they submit a photo of something they saw in a state where we're not doing an atlas. There's no community crowdsourcing of the identification. And so it's just me or my colleagues at Xerces who might end up identifying it. So it's a somewhat different process. If you start an atlas in Colorado, yes, I would encourage you to use Bumblebeewatch for data management, but you would want to explore the details of how you're going to do the identifications and interact with Xerces on that. So I'm a huge fan of both of these platforms, and I think you could successfully do a project with either platform, and they are just a little bit different.
Very cool. Okay, thank you. And last question from the audience. I have a million more. People aren't going to drop more in the chat. Are you hopeful that you will find the Franklin's bumblebee at some point?
Oh, I'm hopeful. I'm stupidly hopeful. We have not seen this bee since 2006, and that is despite a steady increase in the number of people looking for it. And last year, I think there were 80 plus people together on one day in one of the historic field sites looking for the bee. And then they fanned out for the week looking in other places, and it was not found. If it's still there, it's hanging out somewhere where we are not looking, or it's so rare that we just haven't yet chanced upon it. So yes, I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic that there's definitely a bunch of areas out in Northern California and Southern Oregon that are very difficult to get to, high elevation places. It could be hanging on somewhere in the Klamath or Siskiyou mountain ranges. and we just haven't found it. But we will see. We will see. I think within the next few years, we'll be able to say with some certainty whether or not it is extinct.
Totally. I have a question kind of off of that. So you mentioned that there were 3 historic bumblebee species that you didn't identify, at least in the first year of the project. Do you think that they could have species-specific behavioral differences that make it more difficult for them to be found or identified? Or is it probably more just a matter of they're too rare or like a geographic issue?
For 2 of them, it's geography and rarity. It's Franklin's bumblebee and Suckley bumblebee. Suckley's only been found in the state 4 times, maybe, and only in extreme Northern California. So it's a bee that we know it has become more rare at the southern extent of its range across the continent. And so I'm not terribly optimistic about finding that bee in California. It's not extinct. It still occurs in the Yukon and Alaska and British Columbia and elsewhere, but I think we probably have lost that one in California. We will see. The 3rd species is Kirby Ellis, or Balteatus is the old name for it. That one is a high elevation specialist. It's found from about 6,000 feet to 13,000 or higher, and really prefers those alpine meadows. It's a very distinctive bee, easy to distinguish from others because it's in its own little category. I know that we'll find that one. It's been seen in the last couple of years in the Sierras and the White Mountains in Eastern California. So I'm confident it's still out there. We just failed to find it last year.
Gotcha. Have you found that, for example, high elevation specialist bees have declined more dramatically than others because of they're like more susceptible to climate change effects?
It's complicated. It's possible that high elevation species are at higher risk than low elevation. And this is because we know climate change, climate warming is causing bumblebee populations to move upward in elevation. And we can see this in that same sort of data that I was showing you plots from today. Historically, people would have found a species like Kirby Ellis at, let's just make up a number, like 9,000 feet on average. Now it's at 10,000 feet on average. Again, I made that up, but the data bear out those kinds of patterns. So at some point, those guys will run out of runway. They will run out of mountain to persist on, and montane populations will go locally extinct, right? Kirby Ellis, or Balteatus, it's also found widely in the Colorado Rockies, but in California, it is stuck on the Sierra Nevadas and the White Mountains at high elevation. There is no intervening territory that it can use to get to, the populations could expand into to eventually link up with the ones in Washington or BC. Those bees are on an island, and it doesn't look good for them in the long run if we don't turn climate change around. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Very cool. We have one more so far question. Is Picture Insect app reliable for IDing bumblebees? I don't know if you've heard of that.
I don't know anything about that app. So, I'll just say, though, I bet that's an app that uses AI and has been trained on images and then can tell you what is in an image. There are some other artificial intelligence apps that are pretty good at identifying bees, and one of them is built into Inaturalist. So if you use Inaturalist and you try that suggestion feature, it will not always tell you the correct species name for a bumblebee, but it is usually correct if your photos are decent. So I would encourage people to play around with that.
Very cool. Awesome.
Don't trust it, but try it out.
Yes. We have another question. In your opinion, how big of a problem are pathogens, viruses, for example, from managed colonies to bumblebees?
In my opinion, they're a very large problem. So this is the phenomenon where managed bees like honeybees and bumblebees that live in hives that you buy from a business, I will say they almost always have diseases. There is a lot of effort put into keeping those bees clean, but honeybees, even when they're free of those mites, which regulators always check for, they usually have viruses, and those viruses are left at flowers when the bees forage, and they're picked up by wild insects. So we know that some of those viruses can cause problems in bumblebees. For example, deformed wing virus is one that causes the wings to be sort of gnarled and not functional for flying. And those who work on bumblebees have probably seen this. You'll occasionally find bees in nature that have no wings, and this is why. It's a big problem. It's a problem because honeybees are so pervasive. It's also a problem because our culture prizes honeybees in a sort of outsized way. And we seem to think it's a public good to put them in wildlands, to put them on rooftops, to put them in backyards, to make more of them just to have them around somehow. This is an agricultural animal that belongs on farms. It's very important to agriculture. Belongs in agriculture. But just as you wouldn't want to put chickens out in a national park or a BLM property or national forest, you also don't want to put honeybees there. They just don't belong there if your goal is conservation of biodiversity and existing ecosystem values. So it's a problem. It's hard to say exactly how serious a problem it is, but there is a sign that some of the bumblebee diseases that have caused declines have come from managed bees.
Awesome. Well, I have a million more questions, but I will let you go because we could be here all day. Thank you everyone so much for attending today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation as much as I did. Just a heads up, you are going to be subscribed to our monthly newsletter. If you want to unsubscribe, it's super easy. Please feel free to do so, just letting you know. And thank you again to Leif for this amazing presentation. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks so much, Leif.